The letter came to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a cold, icy morning in January 1897, written in the shaky hand of a factory manager who said sorry 3 times for his bad writing before saying what he meant. He spoke of a black cleaning woman's child, about 13 years old, who was found late one night in the Institute's engineering lab, standing near a chalkboard covered in math problems that the teachers had not solved for 3 weeks. The girl had finished the proof, not just copied it from somewhere else or guessed the answer by chance, but had worked through 17 steps of high-level math and mechanics that students could not solve, using methods that were not in any book. The manager, a practical man named Thomas Ricks, had discovered her there at 2 in the morning during his security walk, chalk dust on her dark fingers, tears running down her face. When he asked what she was doing, she had whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm so very sorry. I just needed to fix it. The numbers were wrong, and it was hurting my mind to see it broken like that." Professor Harrison Webb, who led MIT's Applied Mathematics Group, had received hundreds of letters in his 30-year career claiming great finds or impossible acts. He burned most of them without reading past the first part. But something about this letter, perhaps the manager's clear unease with his own claims, perhaps the specific details of the math involved, made Webb stop. He knew those problems. His advanced students had been trying to solve them for weeks, hoping to prove a theoretical way to figure out the strength of hanging bridge cables under changing wind. The mathematics needed an understanding of advanced calculations, physics, material studies, and engineering rules that took years of school to grasp. The idea that a black child, likely unable to read, the daughter of a cleaner, could solve what his best students could not, seemed silly at first. Yet, Thomas Ricks had copied the girl's work from the chalkboard before wiping it clean, following the rule to clear the board each night. The solution was with his letter, written in Ricks's careful block letters. Webb checked it that afternoon, then checked it again that evening, then showed it to 2 fellow teachers the next morning. The proof was right, not just right, but graceful. It used a way of looking at the problem that none of the faculty had thought of, a way of seeing the issue that somehow made simple what they had been making too hard. Whoever had written this understood math at a level beyond simple counting. This was true mathematical insight, the kind that could not be taught, only found in those rare minds that could see the hidden structure of numbers and forces. Professor Webb left for Boston's South End the next week, taking a notebook, a pencil, and a deep doubt that was already starting to fade. Before we go on with what happened when Webb found Lydia Johnson and her mother in their rented room, I want to ask you something. If you are interested in the forgotten stories of smart people who challenged everything we thought we knew about who should be called a genius, subscribe to this channel and leave a note telling me what historical puzzle you would like us to look at next. I am building something special here, a community that refuses to let these voices stay quiet. Now let me tell you what Professor Webb found in that cold rented house, and why it would finally break everything he thought was true about the human brain. The South End in 1897 was where Boston kept the people it needed but did not wish to see. Irish people who had moved there lived close together with former slaves and their children. All of them worked the jobs that kept the city running while living in places that kept them out of sight. The house where Lydia Johnson lived with her mother, Clara, was on a thin street that never got direct sun. 4 floors of watermarked brick and broken window covers. The smell of cold smoke and cooked cabbage hung in the hallways like a constant mist. Webb climbed to the 3rd floor, his costly coat drawing suspicious looks from people who knew the clothes of someone from a different world. He found the room number Ricks had given and knocked, feeling very aware of how wrong this visit was. A white professor, not married, visiting a black woman and her child in a rented room. If the Institute's leaders heard about it, there would be questions. But curiosity had won over good manners, that risky desire that makes scientific men peer into places they have been told not to look. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 35, her face tired from years of hard work and endless worry. She wore a simple gray dress fixed carefully at the elbows, her hair covered in a faded blue cloth. When she saw Webb, a flash of fear crossed her face before she hid it, replacing it with the calm look that black people had learned to show to white authority. "Ma'am, I am Professor Harrison Webb from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am looking for Mrs. Clara Johnson." "I am Clara Johnson, sir." Her voice was soft, expecting bad news because that is what visits from white men usually brought. "Is your daughter here? Miss Lydia Johnson?" Clara's hand gripped the door frame tightly. "What is this about? Is she in trouble? Sir, if she did something bad at the Institute, I promise she will not go back. I told her to stay in the supply room while I clean, to not touch anything. But sometimes she walks around. Children get curious. It will not happen again. She is not in trouble, Mrs. Johnson, just the opposite. I need to talk to her about something she did, something special she did." Those words seemed to take all the color from Clara's face. She stepped back, opening the door wider, ready for whatever results were coming. The room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window that looked out at a brick wall. A narrow bed was against one wall. A small table with two unmatched chairs was in the middle, and in the corner, a pile of blankets on the floor suggested where the child slept. The place was very clean, the poverty absolute but respectful. A black girl sat at the table, looking at something in her lap. She was small for 13, her body thin in a way that showed meals were often skipped so her mother could eat. Her skin was dark brown, her hair tightly braided, her dress a faded cotton that had been let out several times as she grew. When she looked up at Webb, he saw her eyes, large and dark, and holding something that made him deeply uneasy. They were eyes that looked at him and past him at the same time, eyes that seemed to be figuring out something he could not see. "Lydia, this is Professor Webb from MIT. He wants to speak with you." Clara's voice held a hidden warning. "Be polite, be small. Don't give them reasons." "Good afternoon, sir." Lydia's voice was just a whisper. She stood up, putting aside what she'd been holding, a piece of newspaper she was studying. Webb moved closer, curious. The newspaper page showed an advertisement for farm tools, but Lydia had covered the edges with tiny mathematical notes, numbers and symbols written in pencil so small they were hard to read. "Miss Johnson, I want to ask you about something that happened last Tuesday night at the Institute. The manager, Mr. Fricks, found you in one of our labs. Do you remember?" Lydia's eyes dropped to the floor. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I know I should not have been there." "What were you doing?" "I was looking at the chalkboard, sir, the one with the bridge problems." "Why?" The question seemed to confuse her, as if the answer was clear. "Because they were wrong, sir. The professors had made a mistake in the third step, and everything after that was wrong because of it. It was like a building with a broken base. I could see it was going to fall." Webb felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You could see the mistake?" "Yes, sir." "Can you explain what was wrong?" Lydia looked at her mother, asking for permission. Clara nodded slightly, though her face suggested she had no idea what her daughter was about to say. The professors were treating the wind force as if it came from just one way, but wind does not work like that. It spins and changes. So you cannot use a simple line. You have to think about the turning and the time change. I have watched wind move through the city. I have seen how it pushes against buildings and bridges. It is not simple. It is complex. She said this as if describing something she could see right in front of her, as if the math of wind and force were visible things that anyone could see if they just looked properly. Webb took out his notebook. Miss Johnson, I am going to write down some problems. I want you to look at them and tell me if you can solve them. Over the next 2 hours, in that cold, rented room, Harrison Webb did what would become one of the most important intellectual tests of the 19th century. He began with simple counting problems that any educated 12-year-old could do. Lydia solved them instantly, barely looking at the paper. He moved on to algebra, then geometry, then trigonometry. She worked through everything without stopping, often giving answers before he finished writing the problems. Her ways were sometimes unusual, methods that Webb had never seen before, but her answers were perfect. Then he moved into high-level math, calculus, differential equations, complex theoretical problems that his graduate students had trouble with. Lydia's speed never dropped. She would look at a problem. Her eyes would follow the numbers in a way that suggested she was seeing something beyond the symbols themselves, and then she would give the solution. Sometimes he would ask if she could show him how she saw it, and when he agreed, she would draw strange pictures, visual ways of showing mathematical relationships that were both foreign and completely logical. "Where did you learn this?" Webb asked, after she had correctly solved a problem in fluid movement that had taken him 2 days to work through when he was a doctoral student. "I did not learn it, sir. I just see it." "What do you mean you see it?" Lydia struggled to explain, her young voice looking for words to describe something that should not be possible. "When I look at numbers, sir, I do not see what other people see. I see shapes, patterns. Math is not symbols on paper for me. It is like the structure in my head. I can see how numbers connect, how forces balance, how systems work. When I look at a problem, I am seeing the shape of what it is describing. The bridge problem. I could see the bridge in my mind, see the forces acting on it, see how the math had to bend to match the reality of the thing. Does that make sense? It made no sense. It made terribly shocking sense. Webb had heard of gifted people, those with very specific skills, counting wizards who could multiply huge numbers in their heads, but could not understand why the calculations worked. But Lydia was not just a gifted person. She understood the basic rules. She could explain how she figured things out. She could use her skills on new problems. This was not the idiot savant condition. This was true, deep mathematical genius, the kind that appeared maybe once in a generation, and it had appeared in a black girl living in poverty, the daughter of a cleaner who had somehow taught herself high-level math simply by watching the world around her. "How do you know about physics, about engineering?" Webb asked. "From watching, sir. Mama cleans at MIT 5 nights a week. I go with her because she cannot leave me alone here. It is not safe. I am supposed to stay in the storage room while she works. But sometimes I walk around when the buildings are empty. I look at the chalkboards. I read the books left open on desks. I watch how things work, how machines move, how bridges hold weight, and I see the math beneath it all. It is like the world is made of numbers and forces, and I can see the problems that make everything happen." Clara had been standing quietly by the door, watching her daughter with a mix of fear and pride. Now she spoke, her voice tight. "Is she wrong in the head, Professor? The other mothers? They say she is strange, that it is not normal for a child to think the way she does. I have been worried, sir, that something is not right with her." Webb looked at this woman who had no schooling herself, who worked long, hard hours cleaning other people's mess, who was asking if her daughter's brilliance was a sickness. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter is not wrong in the head. She is amazing. She has skills that I have never met in my whole career. She is solving problems that trained math experts cannot solve. She is understanding ideas that take years of university education to grasp, and she is doing it naturally, as if her mind works on a different level than the rest of us." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Is that good or bad, sir?" And there was the real question, wasn't it? In a world that believed black people were less smart, that used that supposed weakness to excuse separation and denying rights, that built its whole social order on the idea that people like Clara and Lydia Johnson were basically less capable than white people. What did it mean to find a black child whose skills were better than those of the most educated white men? Was that good or bad? I do not know, Webb admitted, but I need to understand it. I need to test her more, write down her skills, try to figure out how her mind works. Will it help her? Clara asked, cutting through all the scientific interest to the only question that mattered to her as a mother. Will whatever you do help my daughter have a better life? Webb wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that showing Lydia's skills would open doors, would prove to the world that intelligence had no color, would force society to admit that its racial ideas were lies. But he had lived in this world long enough to know better. I honestly do not know, Mrs. Johnson, but I can promise you this. I will do everything I can to make sure that she is safe, that she is not used, that her skills are used to help her, not to hurt her. Clara looked at her daughter, at this child who saw the world in problems, who had been blessed or cursed with a mind that would not stop counting. Lydia, my dear, what do you want? Lydia's answer was simple, heartbreaking in its simplicity. I want to learn, Mama. I want to understand more. The math I can see. It is like I am looking at a book with half the pages gone. I can see some of it, but there is so much more I know is there, but cannot see yet because I have not learned the words for it. I want to know the rest. How could a mother deny her child that? How could anyone who claimed to care about knowledge and truth deny a mind like this the chance to grow? All right, Clara said finally. But, Professor Webb, if this goes wrong, if they hurt her or use her or try to take her from me, I will run. I will take her and we will vanish and you will never find us. Do you understand? I understand. Webb returned to MIT and at once wrote to 3 fellow teachers whose judgment he trusted, asking them to come to Boston to check what he had found. Within 2 weeks, 3 of America's best mathematicians had made the journey to that rented room. All 3 left shaken, convinced, unable to explain what they had seen. Lydia Johnson could solve any math problem they gave her. She could picture complex spatial relationships. She could understand abstract theoretical ideas that should not be possible for someone without formal training. And perhaps most amazing, she could expand existing theories, suggesting new ways and methods that, when the professors checked them later, proved to be valid new ideas. She was not just copying or remembering, she was creating truly moving mathematical thought forward. By February, word had begun to spread through academic circles, not publicly, not yet, but in the careful letters between scholars, the quiet talks at meetings. There is a black girl in Boston. Webb found her. You have to see it to believe it. And with that spreading awareness came the unavoidable question that would define everything that followed. What do we do with her? MIT's Board of Leaders met in a sudden session on February 18, 1897. Professor Webb presented his findings, bringing papers showing Lydia's skills, statements from the visiting mathematicians, and a plan. The institute should give Lydia formal education, maybe a special tutoring plan, since admitting a black female student would be impossible with current rules. They should study her, yes, but gently, respectfully, in ways that would help her grow her skills while keeping her safe from being used. The board's answer was more complex than Webb had expected. Half the leaders saw Lydia as a scientific chance, a way to understand where mathematical genius comes from, possibly to prove that intelligence went beyond race. The other half saw her as a difficulty. If word got out that a black child was smarter than white MIT graduates, it would challenge everything that excused the current social order. It would be fuel for those who wanted to end separation and force racial mixing. It would shame the institute, raise questions about who they let in, possibly lose them donors and students from the South. The agreement they reached satisfied no one. Lydia would be allowed to study at MIT, but only in complete secrecy. She would come at night when no students were there. She would work with select professors who understood how sensitive the situation was. Under no circumstances would her existence be publicly known. She would be a ghost, a shadow, allowed to learn but forbidden to officially exist. Webb agreed because it was better than nothing. Clara agreed because her daughter would finally get the schooling she had wanted so badly. Lydia agreed because she did not yet grasp that being brilliant and black and female in 1897, America meant that her mind would always be treated as either a danger to be silenced or a curiosity to be studied, but never simply as a person with gifts to be encouraged. The plan began in March, 3 nights a week after Clara finished her cleaning work. Lydia would go into the math building through a service door and make her way to a small classroom where Webb and sometimes other faculty members would wait. They would give her problems, teach her formal math language for ideas she already understood naturally, and watch in amazement as she soaked up years of education in weeks. She learned calculus in 1 month, differential equations in 2 weeks, theoretical physics in 6 weeks. She read Newton's Principia and found errors that had been missed for 2 centuries. She looked at new work on electromagnetism and suggested changes to Maxwell's equations that predicted things that would not be proven with experiments for another decade. She was simply the most extraordinary mathematical mind any of them had ever met, and she was forbidden to exist. But secrets like this do not stay secret. By April, rumors had reached outside academic circles. A reporter from the Boston Globe, following quiet talks about strange nighttime activities at MIT, began asking questions. Southern papers, always watching for anything that might challenge racial differences, picked up the story in a mixed-up way. Reports of black genius in the North, probably a lie. Scientific magazines began getting letters demanding clarification. And in Virginia, a man named Dr. Marcus Thorne, who had built his career on studying skulls to prove black intellectual weakness, read about Lydia Johnson and became fixated on proving she was not real. Thorne was 53 years old, a doctor by training, a racial theorist by deep interest. He had written widely on skull measurements, brain weights, facial angles, all the fake science that white superiority had dressed in the clothes of objective research. His work was used in legal decisions supporting separation, in political speeches excusing denying rights, in popular books explaining why racial order was natural and unavoidable. And now this girl in Boston threatened to destroy everything he had built. If a black child could show mathematical skills better than educated white men, then the main idea of racial science, that intelligence was set by race, was false. Thorne could not allow that. He wrote to MIT's Board of Leaders demanding access to examine Lydia, to check her abilities, to decide whether this was true genius or some clever deception. His letter carried a hidden threat. If MIT refused to allow a proper scientific examination, Thorne would publicly claim they were making up a lie, using a trained child to create false proof of black intelligence for political reasons. The board, caught between different pressures, made another compromise. They would allow a controlled examination by a group of outside scientists, including Thorne, to check Lydia's abilities and decide what they meant. Webb argued against this. He had read Thorne's work. He knew the man's plan, but the board overruled him. Better to allow the examination and let the truth speak for itself than to look like they were hiding something. The examination was planned for May 15, 1897, and Professor Harrison Webb, who had found Lydia Johnson and promised to keep her safe, could feel control of the situation escaping him, could sense that something awful was coming, something he would be unable to stop. But he had no idea just how awful it would become, or how far men would go to suppress a truth that threatened their whole view of the world. And that is where we must stop. The examination room they chose was on MIT's third floor, a place usually used for advanced lab work, now cleared of equipment and set up like a courtroom. A long table at one end held the panel of examiners: Dr. Marcus Thorne from Virginia, Dr. Edmund Cartwright from Yale's psychology department, Professor Lawrence Hamilton from Harvard's medical school, and two representatives from MIT's own faculty. Professor Webb sat to the side, technically just watching, but truly helpless. At the room's center stood a smaller desk, a single chair, and nothing else. This is where Lydia would sit, alone, visible from all directions, subject to scrutiny from every side. Clara Johnson waited outside in the hall, forbidden from coming in. The board had decided that her presence might somehow affect the examination, as if a cleaning woman could secretly signal advanced mathematical solutions to her daughter. When Lydia entered, walked in by a grim-faced administrator, the five men at the table became quiet, looking at her with the cold detachment they might apply to an unusual specimen under a microscope. She wore her best dress, which was still worn and patched, her hair braided so tightly it pulled at her scalp. She was 13 years old, barely 5 feet tall, maybe 70 pounds, walking into a room full of white men who had the power to decide her whole life. Webb watched her face, looking for fear, but what he saw instead was that strange, analytical look she wore when facing a math problem, as if she was calculating the size of the trap she had walked into. "Sit down, girl," Thorne said, not using her name. Lydia sat, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight even though the chair was a little too big for her. Thorne opened a leather folder, pulling out several pages of notes. "We are here to do a scientific check of the claims made about your supposed intellectual skills. You will answer our questions honestly and completely. You will solve the problems we present. You will submit to a physical check if required. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Let us begin with simple questions to establish your background. Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Who taught you?" "I taught myself, sir, by looking at books and newspapers, matching the words to sounds I knew." "You expect us to believe you simply taught yourself to read with no help?" "I do not expect anything, sir. You asked me a question, and I answered it truthfully." There was something in her tone, not quite defiance, but a lack of the submission that Thorne expected from black children. His jaw tightened slightly. "Can you write?" "Yes, sir." "Demonstrate." They gave her paper and a pen. Lydia wrote her name, then a sentence Thorne spoke aloud. "The examination of racial characteristics requires objective scientific methodology." Her handwriting was careful, a little cramped. The letters formed with neatness, if not grace. Thorne examined the paper, then passed it to his colleagues. "Adequate," he said dismissively, as if barely admitting even this small acknowledgement. "Now we will move to mathematical assessment. Dr. Cartwright will present the first problem." Cartwright was younger than Thorne, perhaps 40, with the smooth good looks of someone who had never faced serious opposition to his views. He opened his own folder, chose a page, and read out loud, "A train leaves Boston, traveling west at 40 miles. 2 hours later, a second train leaves Boston, traveling west at 60 miles. How long will it take the second train to catch the first?" It was a problem that any good algebra student could solve, the kind of question meant to establish basic skill. Lydia answered before Cartwright finished reading. 3 hours. Cartwright blinked. "You need to show your work. The first train travels for 2 hours before the second train starts, covering 80 miles. The second train is 20 miles faster, so it closes the distance at 20 miles. 80 divided by 20 equals 4 hours of travel time for the second train. But you asked how long after the second train leaves, so it is 3 hours. Cartwright checked his notes. "That is correct, but you should write out the problems." "If you want me to write them, I will, sir. But you asked for the answer, and I gave it to you." The examination went on for the next hour, moving through harder and harder math: algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. Each time, Lydia would listen to the problem, sometimes ask for clarification of what exactly they wanted her to find, then give the answer with almost no delay. The panel started looking at each other, the kind of looks that pass between people who are seeing something they cannot quite process. Webb watched Thorne's face change from sure superiority to confusion, to something darker. Anger, perhaps, or fear. Around the second hour, Thorne took over the questioning directly. "These are just tricks," he announced. "Memorization and training. The girl has been coached to perform these calculations. We need to test real understanding, not rote answers." He took out a different set of papers, problems he had made specifically for this examination. Complex theoretical questions that could not be solved by memorizing because they required a true understanding of the basic rules. Here is a problem in advanced mechanics. A bridge span of 200 feet is held up by cables arranged in a curve. Given the following details for cable tension, deck weight, and load distribution, calculate the maximum safe load the bridge can support under steady wind pressure of 30 MPa. He read out a series of details, numbers, and measurements that would take even a trained engineer time to organize and understand. Lydia listened, her eyes tracking slightly as if following invisible calculations in the air in front of her. "Sir, I need to clarify something before I answer. What are you asking for? Theoretical maximum load based on the cable details alone, or practical maximum load accounting for deck stress distribution and connection point failure risks?" Thorne stared at her. "Explain the difference. The cables themselves might be able to support a certain weight, but if that weight is spread out unevenly, or if the connection points where the cables attached to the deck are not reinforced properly, the bridge will break at a lower load than the cables alone could theoretically handle. Engineering is not just about separate parts. It is about how systems work together. So, which calculation do you want?" The question showed an understanding that went beyond simple math. This was systems thinking, the ability to see how many factors interacted, the kind of conceptual sophistication that separated good engineers from brilliant ones. "Both," Thorne said finally. "Give me both calculations." Lydia closed her eyes for perhaps 30 seconds, her lips moving slightly as if speaking to herself. Then she opened them and began to speak numbers, explaining her method as she went, describing how she was visualizing the bridge structure, how she was accounting for force distribution, how she was calculating stress factors at important spots. She gave two numbers, one for theoretical maximum based on cable strength alone, another lower number for practical maximum accounting for system weaknesses. The panel sat in silent shock. Finally, Hamilton from Harvard spoke up. "Dr. Thorne, do you have the solutions to these problems?" "Of course." "Are her answers correct?" Thorne checked his notes, taking longer than necessary, clearly hoping to find a mistake. His face darkened as he compared Lydia's answers to his own calculations. "The first answer is correct. The second answer uses a method I had not considered but seems to be right." "Seems to be?" Webb could not stay quiet any longer. "Either the math is sound or it is not. The math may be sound, but that does not prove she figured it out herself. She could have been taught these specific problems." "Then give her a problem she has not seen," Webb shot back. "Give her something new, something you create right now that could not possibly have been expected." Thorne's face suggested this was exactly what he wanted. He stood, moving to the chalkboard on one wall, and began writing. He spent 15 minutes creating a problem, a complex situation involving fluid movement, pressure calculations, and three-dimensional spatial reasoning. It was the kind of problem that would appear in an advanced physics test, the kind that graduate students would spend an hour solving with access to reference books and tools. When he finished, he turned to Lydia. "Solve this." She studied the board for several minutes, her head tilting slightly. that strange, focused gaze suggesting she was seeing something beyond the symbols written in chalk. Then she stood, walked to the board, and asked, "May I show my work here, sir?" "Please do." What followed was, for Webb, one of the most amazing demonstrations of mathematical thinking he had ever witnessed. Lydia did not just solve the problem. She reorganized it, finding a more graceful approach than the one Thorne had expected, using visual pictures that made complex relationships suddenly clear. She drew diagrams showing force directions. She noted simple assumptions that could be made without losing accuracy. She caught a mistake in Thorne's original setup where he had accidentally used the wrong unit conversion, and she explained everything in simple language, teaching as she solved, making her thinking visible and easy to understand. When she finished, she set down the chalk and returned to her seat, leaving the board covered in her work. The room was quiet except for the sound of breathing and the distant noise of the city outside. Professor Hamilton rose and approached the board, examining Lydia's work closely. He followed her logic, checked her numbers, studied her diagrams. Finally, he turned to face his colleagues. "Gentlemen, I do not know how to say this politely, so I will be direct. This is real genius. This is not training or memorization or some kind of trick. This girl understands advanced math at a level that I rarely see in doctoral candidates. She is not just solving problems. She is showing real creative mathematical thought." "Impossible," Thorne said flatly. "There must be some explanation, some technique she is using to create the illusion of understanding." "What explanation do you suggest?" Hamilton challenged. "That Professor Webb spent months training her to solve thousands of possible problems so she could perform instantly? That she somehow memorized ways to solve problems she has never seen? Be reasonable, Marcus. Sometimes the proof forces us to change our ideas. My ideas are based on decades of skull study research, on measurements of thousands of samples, on documented biological differences between the races." "Then perhaps your ideas are wrong." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Thorne's face turned red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I will not have my life's work dismissed because of some oddity. Science is about understanding the general rule, not being distracted by exceptions." "She is not an exception," Webb broke in. "Or rather, she is, but not in the way you think. She is an exception in human thinking generally, not in black thinking specifically. What she proves is that the ability for this kind of genius exists across all racial lines. That our theories,